Are you haunted by the thought that random people you pass on the street might have no idea that you're a fan of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy? Well, it's time to fix that by ordering a Geek's Guide to the Galaxy t-shirt over at geeksguide.threadless.com. And I want to thank Muriel Ingracia, Anders Kilstedt, Tyler Lutz, and Chrissy Lutz for being among the first to order their very own Geek's Guide to the Galaxy t-shirts. See a photo of Tyler and Chrissy looking gorgeous in their snazzy red Geek's Guide to the Galaxy t-shirts over at geeksguideshow.com. Alright, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 403 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Gwyneth Jones. She's the author of many books, including the Bold as Love series of rock and roll fantasy novels, and the Illusion series of far future science fiction novels. Her literary criticism has been collected in books such as Deconstructing the Starships, Science, Fiction, and Reality, and she's also written 20 young adult books under the name Anne Hallam. And we'll be speaking with her today about her new short story collection, Big Cat and Other Stories, and about her new nonfiction book, Joanna Russ, which explores the life and work of science fiction's most outspoken feminist writer. And now here's our interview with Gwyneth Jones. All right, so we're here with Gwyneth Jones. Welcome to the show.
Hi. I'm in Brighton.
Okay, so your new short story collection is called Big Cat and Other Stories. So how'd this book come
Yes. I just had some short stories, and I asked Ian Waits, who has a small press, if he'd like to bring out a collection, a reasonable sized collection. So I thought I would go with it, and he said, yeah, let's do it. That's how it came about.
So
Very random, really.
How do you know Ian Waits?
Science fiction. I went to a con which he was certainly organising it in Northampton, I think. Yes, and we remained friends from then on, and I've talked to him quite a lot, and he seemed like the right person to approach.
And so these are stories, it looks like the earliest was 2007 through 2019?
Yes, but that's a bit deceptive, because the first one, The Big Cat, has been around for a long time. As I said in the, as I say in the note in the book, it really is the story that I derived from a dream. And I don't dream about my dream worlds, my fiction at all. But on this occasion I did. And then I had several attempts to try and make the fragments of this dream into a story. And Big Cat is the last, I think, attempt I'm going to make. I hope it worked better.
So what happened in the dream?
Now, mostly I can't tell you. I know what I remembered, and it was these two characters from the Bold as Love scenario, and one of them is Cornish, and one of them, he's Steve Pender, known as Eoxamoxoa, and also Sage. And the other one is a rock and roll brat called Fiorinda, and she's rock royalty, but in a very unpleasant connection. And they have become involved in a revolution in England. And now I'm telling you stuff that didn't happen in the dream. This is just that the two characters were in my mind, and they were, as they are in this book, in my dream. But in my dream, it was just a dream of them going to Cornwall and being, they had something to do there. At first it wasn't clear. They were driving across the moor. It was very cold. It was very dark. It was kind of spooky. And they were taking a child to a party. And then there was something about a big cat, and the big cat had attacked maybe a farmhouse and got shot, or maybe the cat had not got shot, maybe a wolf had got shot, or this was unclear, and this interrupted the birthday party journey. And then there was something about trees walking, green and fir trees. They're not fir trees in the actual story, but they were big green conifers, and they were walking sort of through the ground, like in, I don't know if you know the Narnia books.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, well, they were like C.S. Lewis imagines trees walking, not kind of lifting their roots out and plodding them down, just kind of going through the soil. And that's basically it. And from that, I constructed the story because the dream, it was so delightful to have a dream about my fictional characters that I had to do something with it.
Right. So that's Big Cat is one of the stories in this book. And then there's, I think, 10 other stories.
Yeah.
And
it's a mixed bag.
Yeah. I was going to say they cover all sorts of genres and everything. I think the majority of them, or no, 5 of the 11 were written for Jonathan Strahan anthologies. They sort of were science fiction anthologies.
Yeah.
Do you think do you know him well, or do you think there's that his anthologies are a particularly good fit for your stories or anything like that?
All I know of him really is that he likes my stories, which is, I think that's pretty good. And I think his anthologies, I mean, I read the anthologies when they've got one of my stories in them, of course. And he seems, of course, I think he's got good taste. But I do think that they have been a great institution, yes, for people like me, certainly.
Yeah, well, I think all these stories, except maybe Big Cat, were written at the request of an editor. Is that right?
I don't know if you'd count the Stella and the Adventurous Roots, because that one was a project that I was invited to join, but in fact they threw me out.
But it was you were invited. You wouldn't have written the story without the invitation, or would you?
That's an interesting question. I usually have, what can I say, proto stories that are kind of in my mind, and I'm thinking, am I going to write this or not? And then somebody will ask me to write a story for an anthology, and I'll think, oh yeah, this one will do. I've just written one called The Ploughshare and the Storm for a Michael Moorcock inspired anthology, and I've been thinking about that story. And what happens is that you have an idea, and then an invitation gives the impetus to make that idea into a story, to figure it out and write it.
So what do you have to do to get thrown out of an anthology?
Well, it was supposed to be a collection of botanical-based science fiction or fantasy stories, and it was, I think it's fair to say, it was commissioned by these people called Wayward Plants, and they were going to get this anthology written by science fiction and fantasy writers, and they would match up I think the idea was they would match up the science fiction and fantasy writers to illustrators, so they would get this book of stories with fantastical plants. And so I wrote Stella and the Adventurous Roots, but the idea of a botanical kind of business that called itself Wayward Plants was kind of deceptive. You've read the story Stella and the Adventurous Roots?
I read the whole book, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, they didn't like the guerrilla gardeners. The guerrilla gardeners were too unconventional, and probably the police should send them away from wherever they get up to, whatever they get up to. So that was a problem. And also there was a strand, if you've read the story, you'll know there is a rather disturbing strand, and they didn't like that being, I suppose I should call it a tendril, not a strand, since it's a botanical story. But anyway, they didn't like that tendril at all, and so they threw me out.
And we should make clear for listeners that we're talking about guerrilla gardeners, like guerrilla fighters, not like gorillas in the mist.
Yeah. No great apes were involved in any way. But there are some unpleasant. There is an unpleasant tendril in the story, or root, or stem, and that they didn't like either.
I'm surprised that they had a problem with the guerrilla gardeners part. I mean, these are just people who they sort of move in the story. They move into real estate that's not being used and sort of set up an impromptu garden.
Yes, and they have no they have no intention of taking over. They are just using derelict space, and they will leave as soon as the developers come back, or whatever it is that's supposed to happen to the space starts happening. And they're also doing things which is it was actually, I mean, this happens all the time in Brighton. When I was working on the story, there were people, I suppose they were guerrilla gardeners, just planting flowers in empty lots. And I think it happens in London too. Maybe it happens all over, but it seems pretty harmless to me. And they weren't going to stand and fight when the developers came back, not by any means. So it was nothing criminal.
Did you ever think about becoming a guerrilla gardener yourself?
My hands get so cold. I do a little bit of ordinary gardening, but I just I just appreciate what they do. I never actually got involved. I don't think I have green fingers.
I mean,
Sorry, I was going to say I did enjoy writing Stella and the Adventurous Roots, though. It's great.
I mean, you do seem to be very interested in nature and Green Party activism and stuff like that.
Not compared to the real people. I'm a dilettante. Is that the way you say it? Anyway, I just make the noises. I am not really much of a demonstrator or a manning the barricades sort of green activist. Although I did do quite a lot of work at our last general election in this country, in the rain and the dark, knocking on doors. Hi, I'm from the Green Party. That was that was a lost cause from the start, but you have to try.
So how do people react when you knock on their door and say you're from the Green Party?
It depends whether they like the Green Party or not. The people in Brighton Pavilion, which is my constituency, they're all pretty... It'd be strange if they weren't aware that they're probably going to get a Green MP, because Caroline Lucas, my MP, is the only Green MP so far. And she always gets... Well, so far, she's always got a strong majority in her constituency. So if they're right-wing and hi, I'm from the Green Party, they just say, and shut the door. And sometimes I've been tempted to say, look, they say I'm not voting. And I've been tempted to say, well, you should vote, because I'm a very public-spirited political activist, because the vote still gets counted, for your party, which it does. I mean, it doesn't have any significance because we don't have proportional representation, but it does get counted. But no, they're not going to vote. So, fine, okay. And then if they are going to vote, and sometimes, in fact, quite often, they're going to vote Green. So it's not too painful.
Yeah, so that's the story Stella and the Adventurous Route.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I mentioned that a bunch of these stories are sort of more, far future science fiction. And a lot of these stories you say are, there's this idea of information space you say comes up in your fiction a lot. So could you just lay out what that idea is?
If I had another handful of letters after my name, maybe I could start a little bit. I think I've recommended in Big Cat a book you should start with. Well, I won't start rustling pages now, but it's in there in the
I have. It's called Life Without Genes by Adrienne Wolfson.
Yeah, I read that when I was writing the first or the second Boulder's Love books, when I was trying to work out my magical science in Castles Made of Sand. And I was really thrilled because it really worked for me. But now you're going to ask me to explain it. And it's simply, as far as I can actually explain it, instead of thinking in terms of atoms or subatomic particles or subatomic particles or things even littler than that, you think of everything, the whole stuff, as information, like the noughts and ones of data in some kind of way. And that means that you can have I mean, if it's information, then a rose and love and the words I'm speaking to you are all made out of the same stuff. And that has interesting implications for, for people who are writing science fiction. It is a real thing, the idea of information space science, but whether I understand it or not, oh no, I just use it.
Well, but I think one of the implications, right, is that if everything is basically information at some low level of abstraction, then it's should be technologically possible to transfer things between thought to matter,
Yes.
and things like that, pretty in a sort of straightforward way.
Yes, and what's the other word we have for that behavior? That operation? It's magic. So there you get an interface between magic and science, which is in Boulder's Love, which I found very interesting and fun to play with. But this is not to say that I imagine that I will. I mean, there are some things I imagine that I might see develop, but that, as things stand, that's not one of them. No, I think it's fantasy.
Well, right. So in the books, you have a faster than light technology called the Buonarroti transit. That's sort of an extrapolation of this idea.
It's got the same roots. Oh dear, now you're going to ask me to explain the Buonarroti transit. When you, if you know where exactly you want to go, you can go there. It takes a lot of power, but you can will yourself there. And strange things happen to you on the way, which is, when I say on the way, there is no duration in a Buonarroti transit, but there's an imaginary duration. And then when you get there, you just arrive as yourself. And you may or may not remember the strange things that seem to happen, the dream that seemed to happen on the way.
Well, right, and sort of two of the ideas that I really liked, kind of related to this in the book, are there's one character who travels from planet to planet, and he has his house with all his belongings, everything all laid out how he likes it, transmitted after him. And then when the data arrives, they reconstruct his house exactly the way he likes it, wherever he is. So you just kind of never have to leave home in that way.
Yes. That's Boaz, isn't it? And he's still waiting for his house to arrive when we leave him, actually. But it's
like lose his luggage.
Yes, they lost his luggage. But everything travels as data and gets reconstructed, including people's minds when they arrive. But things do get messed up. And occasionally things get messed up very badly, like as has happened to the woman in Isabel Jewell in the story.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is in the story Cheats, you have these characters who play all these virtual reality games and are constantly bouncing between these different virtual game worlds. And then they actually inadvertently go through one of these sort of transfer things and end up on another planet in physical reality and don't realize that that's happened. They think they're still in a game world. I thought that was a really sort of eerie idea. Yes. They don't realize that they could die at any moment.
Yes. Well, one of them is safe because she's on life support, but her brother isn't safe because he's healthy and he's just got some kind of headset on back on Earth, sitting in a chair or something, and he could die. That's the again, a word I can't say. An anaphylactic shock kills you if you realize what's happened to you, and you just can't count. You're dead. I don't think that these things are exactly all the same technology. I think it's all the same field of ideas. I don't think that what happens in Cheats is the same as what happens in the Aleutian trilogy or as what happens in the Boulder's Love books. I don't think you can join them up and make it a technology that's coherent through the whole kind of Gwyneth Jones universe. But I don't mind that. I mean, one of the things I really do think is that the idea that everything joins up and fits together and is seamlessly connected, I don't think that's true. I think that things are as things in the universe are just as messy as they are in our minds.
I also want to mention, I really like some of the ideas in this story, Emergence. It's kind of about artificial intelligence. And one thing I really liked was that these AIs, if they commit a crime, they get punished by having to be put into a physical body, sort of a human body. And this is just a real drag for an AI.
Well, I don't think, no, they don't get put into a human body. They get brought into human time. So, and for a data entity to be pinned down somewhere for what they call meat time is just appalling. It's like several life sentences. It's horrific to be confined that way, but it's not being human that they object to. It's the appalling waste of empty time that is what human time appears to them.
Okay, so a meat week is just spending time at human timescales.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, doing nothing, not doing anything.
Yeah, still a cool idea. I like that idea too. I mean, because that's actually ties into the other thing I wanted to mention with the AI that I really liked is one of the characters on Earth says, "Don't you," to the protagonist who's traveled all over the solar system, says to her, "Don't you worry about the AIs rising up, having a revolution." And she says, "You're thinking like a human. That's not how AIs think because their sense of time is so much different from ours. And,
yeah.
Like we're not even going to be around that long from their point of view. So it's not even worth it to them to overthrow us because, they're just thinking on such different timescales."
Yes, I believe that at that time, at that moment, Romy is looking at the little dog in the hearth and she's saying to her, the questioner, "You have no idea." And she says that they are very sad because we're not immortal. And the idea that you can die, that you will die, I mean, it's just like having a pet that only lives for 3 or 4 years. Having a human being around, because you know that in the end, no matter how many times, how many iterations of this person you can manage, you're going to get to the end of it. And the story with Romy is how she's run out of her capacity for rejuvenating her tissues. She gets the death sentence. And there's only one answer when you've got the death sentence. And she finds out what it is, and it's quite amazing.
So then I also wanted to ask you about the Joanna Russ book. So could you just tell us about how that came about?
I was approached by an editor for the Masters in Science Fiction Studies at the University of Illinois Press. And she asked me, would I consider doing one of these pieces, and she had a handful of writers who were kind of in the pipeline to be given the treatment, and I said the only one that I really felt competent to write about would be Joanna Russ, and she said, "You've got it." So that's the way it started, and wow, that was 5 years ago, pretty much. Yeah, it took a long time to get that book out.
So why did you feel that you would be a good match for the Joanna Russ project?
Because I wasn't around for the 60s and 70s, but I was there in the 80s, and I was involved in the Tiptree Award judging because a book of mine got kind of the first Tiptree Award. You know what the Tiptree Award is? I guess you do.
Yeah, but maybe we could explain for listeners that it's an award in science fiction that is about exploring gender roles and gender in science fiction.
Yes, it was about exploring and expanding gender roles. And luckily, they didn't work out until it was too late. That my only interest in exploring and expanding binary gender roles was so I could track them down and burn out the nests. But luckily they didn't spot that until they read the book and decided to give it half the prize, I suppose. Anyway, so I spent time with people who were involved in the the 70s, the feminist 70s, and I met I met quite a few of the writers who were involved with Joanna Russ. I never met Joanna Russ, and I had been in part of the conversation, quite interested in it, and that was what made me feel that I probably could write about her. And I'd also already written the introduction for the Gallant's Masterworks edition of The Female Man. So I had at least one book that I had studied in quite a lot of detail. So I'll do it. And then I started working on it, and there was a lot of work. It's not like writing a biography. It's more a compilation. You're presenting this writer who is to some extent or other centrally significant, or at least believed to be or felt to be centrally significant to science fiction, and you're presenting all the information about their life, about their career in science fiction. And it's intended, I think, mostly maybe for undergraduates, graduates, and for university libraries. So it's quite, I wouldn't say, not technical, but it's not fiction and it's not biography. It's getting together a whole lot of facts, and then, as a reward for this, you get to write about the books and the stories as well, and read them again, which was pretty nice.
So when you say that she's considered such an important author, for people who aren't familiar with her, could you say why she's considered so important?
Joanna Russ was the best known, and in fact maybe held by some to be the most important of the women in the 70s in science fiction who were actually claiming to have human status, who were claiming to have equality, at least equality, with most science fiction writers who were male. Not all the women who were involved in science fiction at that time believed that this was necessary or useful, and there was quite a lot of scrapping in the feminist camp and outside the feminist camp. And Joanna Russ was always in the middle of it, and she was also very much more intellectually. She had much more intellectual training and intellectual capacity. I mean, a capacity for thinking intellectually about science fiction than most writers ever bother with. So I think it would be fair to say that she and Samuel Delany, between them, kind of invented academic science fiction academia, science fiction scholarship back in the 60s and 70s. And she also wrote a terrific number of short stories, because science fiction writers, it was their bread and butter in the 60s and 70s, as it had been in the 50s and 40s and 30s. There were many more science fiction story outlets than there are now. Well, I don't know whether that may not be true anymore, because there are so many digital outlets. And she also taught science fiction, and she wrote essays, and she wrote reviews for years for the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, which are, well, they're sometimes more fun for the people reading the review than for the person that wrote the book. Yeah, some of her most famous reviews are famous put downs.
Well, the one that sticks out in my mind, there was this thing about Robert Silverberg where he's like a sausage factory trying to become an artist.
Sausage factory, yeah, a sausage factory trying to become an artist. Robert Silverberg, for those who don't know, was the pretty much the humanist, novelist, science fiction writer of the 70s. I should say male science fiction writer of the 70s. And he wrote books that were actually real, proper, grown-up novels, only on science fiction themes. And after she wrote that, Joanna was very, very worried, and she wrote him a grovelling apology groveling public apology. No, it wasn't really groveling. Actually, she never groveled. She was more like saying, she said, I did not mean to say that Robert Silverberg was a sausage factory trying to turn himself into an artist. Robert Silverberg is a terrific literary artist who is still working towards his full potential. Something like that. Yeah, she didn't totally back down. She didn't roll over, but she definitely was very keen to apologize. She was always wanting the people that she thought were good in her science fiction reviews. She was always wanting the people she thought were good to be better, to be more intellectual and more challenging. But at the same time, she was really soft in the head about people like Ray Bradbury. She loved his stories. She kind of didn't want to, but she loved his kind of fairy tale stories. And there were other 60s science fiction writers who certainly weren't trying to do anything particularly intellectual, that she just loved because she just loved the genre. And then she'd say to the people who were really trying hard, you've got to try harder. You've got to make this more intellectual, more demanding, more exciting. And so it was like, if you got a bad review from Joanna Russ, you were supposed to think, she loves me. So I don't know if people always did.
Well, this line really jumped out at me. She says, in the interview, she says, I say very angry things about Ursula Le Guin quite often, but it's the anger of disappointed adoration. In some daughterly part of me, I feel she's capable of writing something like War and Peace about women, damn it.
Yeah, that was her tone with all the people that she really admired. It was, I really love your book, but you've got to do something better than this. I never had the privilege of being reviewed by Joanna Russ, and I'm not sure I missed anything. But she did understand people, and that must have been quite thrilling to get an in-depth review from Joanna Russ and find that somebody, and I think Ursula did get these reviews from Joanna, that was somebody who really understood what you were trying to do and who could explain your novel to you, which is, it's magic if you're a writer, if you get a reviewer who can do that.
You say that one of the sources that you drew on was this book by Helen Merritt called The Secret Feminist Cabal.
Mm-hmm.
I was just curious what made it secret and a cabal.
How did The Secret Feminist Cabal come about? I think it was somebody, I have a feeling that it was supposed to be not exactly an insult, but a warning to other writers that there was this secret feminist cabal. And of course, feminists in science fiction being what they were at the time, they just leapt on this and thought, yeah, we're a secret feminist cabal. It was, it's no use, I can't remember who it was that thought of this idea, but it wasn't feminists who said it first. And Helen Merritt wrote the book, which was just a report on what had happened to women in science fiction in the 70s and where it came from and where it might be going. So it wasn't actually secret. And if a cabal means everybody has to agree with everyone else and they all get together and have a secret society with rules that they all keep, nothing like that. Nothing like that happened at all. It was more like cats fighting in a bag.
Well, yeah, you mentioned, the scrapping and everything. I mean, that's certainly her interactions with Judith Merrill and Marion Zimmer Bradley stick out in my mind as being sort of contentious.
Yeah. Judith Merrill was probably the most important, the most significant woman in the science fiction community in the 60s and the 50s. And she was passionate about science fiction. And she had a special kind of feminism, which Joanna didn't appreciate at all. She had a special kind of feminism which said, I'm perfectly fine about doing all the housework, etc., and so forth, because I'm more competent than my husband. So I work 13 hours and he works 6, and that's because I'm better than him. So that's a kind of feminism that irritated Joanna. But that's kind of beside the point with what Judith Merril was kind of Joanna's predecessor, and had in the same way as Joanna did, this big dream that science fiction would have its big break and become part of the intellectual world. And she was as Joanna would do in the 60s and 70s, she was working in the 50s and always hoping that the next big break would come, that the space race would make science fiction central to the literary world, and then of course nuclear bombs would make science fiction central to the literary world. It never quite came off. And in the McCarthy days, she said that science fiction was the refuge of people who wanted to speak the truth, to speak truth unto power, and William Gibson said, yeah, that was because science fiction was considered beneath contempt. That's why nobody bothered science fiction writers. I don't know if them's right, but I have a feeling that Gibson would edge it.
Well, yeah, it was sort of heartbreaking reading the book because it seems like she did feel like an outsider in all these different communities, that in English departments and among radical activists, they didn't respect the science fiction that she was writing. And then in science fiction, because she was a woman and a feminist and all this stuff, she always felt like she wouldn't be ever at the center of the boys' club, kind of.
Yeah, I think heartbreaking is not too strong. She really wanted to be science fiction scholarship to be respectable, and she really wanted she first, when The Female Man, most famous book, she spent about 2 years, I think, trying to get it published as a mainstream novel, as a weird mainstream novel, as an avant-garde mainstream novel, but she couldn't find anybody who would take it, so she had to come back to science fiction.
I mean, it sounds like it could be an avant-garde novel with all the fourth wall breaking and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, it's no.
Okay.
I don't think so. I think it's too deeply dyed with science fiction in its blood and bones, that to be, it would have to be written differently. The idea could be somebody now could write that story about the braided personalities in one woman and how they're kind of superpositioned with each other like that cat in the box, and they could make that work. But if it was written by a science fiction writer, it would still be science fiction. If that makes sense. Because
it involves these sort of, I guess, sort of classic science fiction tropes of, a literal war of the sexes and secret agents and parallel worlds and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, but those ideas are now far closer to the mainstream. Just a world, the battle of the sexes. And what was the other thing you said it was about?
Parallel worlds.
Parallel worlds. Yeah, I think that could work I think that the themes of The Female Man could easily work for an avant-garde or a daring mainstream writer now, and be exciting and be recognized as a really interesting way of describing a human experience. Like trying to get hold of the whole of a human experience is very difficult unless you say, well, there are different people in me, and they are different relations with this event, because one of them is like the girl I was when I was 18, and one of them is the person I am now, and one of them is me when I'm in a really bad temper. I can see that working now, but something, what's the word? Ineluctably? I don't know. I'm very poor at pronouncing long words. Science fictional about it, the way it is.
Well, I mean, she was certainly writing at a different time. That's very clear reading your book. I want to read this quote. She writes the Alex stories, Alyx, which is one of the first sort of female adventure heroes.
Yeah.
And she says, writing adventure stories about a woman in which the woman won was one of the hardest things I ever did in my life. Before writing the first story, I spent 2 weeks in front of my typewriter shaking.
Well, first, I expect she didn't actually spend 2 weeks in front of her typewriter shaking. She may have been exaggerating a little. And I find that hard to relate to as well. I think, how can that possibly be? But the upbringing she had and the world that she lived in was very, very different from the world that young women grow up in now. That young women in America or in Europe grow up in now. And she was being told from when she was an undergraduate, actually, your degree will make you a much better housewife. And she did feel, I'm sure she did feel, that she didn't have the right to win, and that a girl didn't have the right to win. And she invented Alex, and I think she probably was scared, but she needn't have been, because everybody loves Alex. Well, put it this way, a whole lot more people love Alex than love the female man.
Well, right, but it seems like she got increasing pushback throughout her career, right? Like her novel "We Who Are About to," which is about a group of humans crashes on this alien world, and they're stranded there permanently, and they decide, well, we have to carry on the human race, which means forcing the women to bear children, and the main character sort of fights back and isn't willing to go along with this plan, and it seems like there was a lot of hostility to that book among male critics at the time.
Well, there was a hostility to Joanna Russ's writing from male critics and male magazine editors and men in general in science fiction. She had some friends, but quite a lot of the men in science fiction were appalled at the they certainly wrote about it as if they were appalled at the way that Joanna was challenging the norms of what women should be in science fiction. Now, the same thing was happening in fandom when female fans were trying to saying we're not here just to be decorative and make the sandwiches. We are really interested in science fiction. It's hard to conceive how difficult it was for them to make that kind of statement because the social acceptance wasn't there, and they would either the men were either really puzzled or really angry and felt threatened. And of course, with Joanna's writing, the anger and the feeling of being threatened was much stronger. But the thing about pregnancy by rape was, it was kind of Joanna was responding rather than inventing the idea of pregnancy by rape as a theme in science fiction. Because it was, as you mentioned, Marion Zimmer Bradley. She'd written about a society where it was absolutely necessary for the women who had been super educated and who were officers on the starship. It was necessary for them to just give all that up and stay at home, not go out and bear children. And they said no. Well, tough. They were forced. And there were other men who wrote about the subjugation of women by making them pregnant, which they weren't. I don't think they were really mainstream, but they were certainly there. It was certainly a pretty relevant theme. I mean, Joanna didn't make it up. And what actually happens in who are about to is that she just tries to escape, and when the people come after her, I mean, this is okay, you can take this any one or two ways. The other survivors refuse to let her go, and unfortunately for them, she's not who she seems. She's actually been an outcast, an activist who has run away from trouble long ago, and she is much, much tougher than they could have imagined. And she just accidentally sort of kills them all. That's her story. If you read the book, you'll see that this is an unreliable narrator you have, which is one of the features of the book, is that you're getting it all from this one woman. You don't get anybody else's point of view, only hers.
So do you feel like doing this Joanna Russ book, has that influenced your writing going forward, do you think?
It's made me appreciate Joanna Russ's writing. When you have to describe in detail how a novel works to an audience, which is really most of the work is actually compilation. You're putting together things that other people have said. And I'm extremely in debt to Farah Mendelssohn and her book of essays, and Gary Wolfe and his essay on the adventures of Alex. And it's mostly quite technical. But yes, actually analysing the novels and trying to figure out a way to describe them concisely, because there's not much wiggle room in the word length of a Masters of Science Fiction study. I think that I don't know what will happen. I think it will affect my writing. I couldn't tell you how yet.
Do you, I know the book came out fairly recently, but have you gotten a lot of feedback on it so far?
There've been quite a few reviews. There's been an article in the New Yorker recently by somebody called B.D. McClay, who wrote about it. There's been Ros Caveney. Do you know Ros Caveney?
I don't think I do, no.
No, anyway, she's an English science fiction person, and she wrote about it. She's pretty significant as well herself, and she wrote about it in the Times Literary Supplement, and there's been lots of online reviews, and most of them are pretty gratifying, actually, because it seems like people were really interested to read about Joanna, and what I would hope is that the people's interest in it, the fact that I didn't put them off, is going to get people reading Joanna Russ, because although her novels have a reputation for being difficult, I suppose there's no use me saying this, but they're not. I mean, the female man is challenging to read, but it isn't challenging if you don't think about it. If you just read it, it's just really interesting and strange. So I do hope that she will have that it will have an effect on her futurity, that people will read and realize what an important person she was in science fiction, especially, and I suppose the academic side of it, and read her essays, which are really, really interesting and fascinating to try. Well, one of the things that's fascinating is trying to figure out exactly what she meant by some of the by some of the things she was saying. But it was a fascinating journey, and I'm sure it will affect my writing in the future.
So if somebody's new to her work, what would be, say, the first two things by her that they should start with?
They should read the story called When It Changed, which is the kind of short science fiction story version of the tragedy of a world where women have made a life for themselves, and they get and suddenly they are approached by planet Earth, which was something they thought was gone, and they would never hear from Earthmen again. But an Earthman turns up, and very, very interested in these healthy women with their fine, clean genes. And it's like, that's genes with the Genes, not Jeans. And that they realize their world is going to come to an end because the men are just so much bigger and stronger and richer. And it's a tragic story, and I suppose that's sounds off-putting, but it's really beautiful, and it's actually really fun as well. Her short stories, I think, are a way into Joanna Russ, and they are still readily available. There's a collection called The Zanzibar Cat, and another one called The Hidden Side of the Moon, and her short stories are really brilliant and easy to grasp. And another, apart from Alex, which I would certainly recommend to anybody, the Alex Adventures, and they're still readily available, and they are really good fun, and beautifully plotted, and tight, and clever, and yet emotional as well. And her last collection, which is like a sequence, a story sequence. It's called Extraordinary People, and it's the stories are all related to the idea of utopia, but they're all very, very different and really engrossing and not at all difficult. Not at all difficult to, no intellectual arguments particularly. Just very fun to read and really exciting.
Yeah, great. So then I just had a couple miscellaneous questions for you here at the end. So one of them is in your story Emergence, one of the characters at one point says, there's no privacy for anyone in public office. It's the law out here, and I think a good one. And I was just curious what you think of. Would you advocate for no privacy for people in public office?
I think in a situation of a completely digitized environment, which is in which most of the people are actually digital entities who may or may not take physical form. They take physical form when they feel like it. It's pretty much unavoidable that nobody will have any privacy. I wouldn't like to live in that way myself. It's the way I think it would have to be in a completely digitized, spaced environment of sailing around in the moons of Jupiter. I mean, it's not that Romy is not me, and her ideas are not mine. But it's what I think will be a necessity, that people won't have privacy, and you can have an imaginary privacy that people respect, which but in public office, you get that imaginary privacy maybe is not enforceable. Is a privilege that you have to give up.
One of the ideas that I sort of think about sometimes is if people holding public office should be required to keep their standard of living to sort of the median household income level standard of living, that holding public office couldn't be a way to live a lavish lifestyle. This would be sort of a lifelong, vow of middle class status. So
this is you're thinking of what, Socrates? Or it certainly sounds quite an ancient Greek idea, that one.
Yeah. What do you think of that?
Good luck. I think, in this country at the moment, not noble poverty, but noble lack of excess seems to be out of favor. And I think that goes for, we had there's a newspaper called The Guardian, and they are I suppose the left-wing liberal newspaper, big left-wing liberal newspaper in this country. I suppose somebody's going to shoot that down, but anyway, that's what it seems like to me. I mean, I don't read newspapers except on my phone. And somebody wrote an article. I don't know whether it was meant to be provocative or it was just a kind of lifestyle article in which she's saying, don't tax the rich, don't tax the billionaires. People like billionaires. I mean, I've felt myself coming up against this when I wrote the sixth Boulder's Love book, which I wrote a few years ago, and it's called The Grasshoppers Child. And the trouble is, a lot of people in this country now seem to think that the rich aren't robbers. The billionaires are not robbers. They're just like me on a good day. I could be one of them. I'm going to be one of them quite soon, so I don't want you to take away all those privileges from billionaires because I'm going to get them soon. I know I am. That's the pernicious attitude that I think people have to wealth at the moment.
Yeah, maybe I can write a science fiction story about it, since it's not happening in reality.
Oh, yeah. Well, please do. Oh, you might say Triton. Samuel Delaney's Society is. Well, I think it's kind of on those lines.
This is Trouble on Triton.
Well, yes. The book, the actual edition I've got, which it's called just Triton. Maybe it's a British edition, but it was Trouble on Triton originally. Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't read it, but it comes up quite a few times in your Joanna Russ book, so it definitely made me curious about it.
Yeah, you should have a look, definitely. And again, it's utopian, but it's a strange kind of utopia.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely check that out.
Yeah.
All right, so probably last topic I'll be able to bring up here is it says in your bio that your hobbies include playing Zelda, and there's this story in the book called The Seventh Gamer, which is about gaming. So I was just wondering if you could talk about how video gaming influenced that story.
Oh, I'm not a big gamer. I'm not really. I mean, I don't play. I'm certainly never going to go and live in a game house. I'm playing Breath of the Wild at the moment, and I'm one of those people who's decided that it's absolute nonsense to beat Ganon and then close the file and go and have another file in Breath of the Wild. Do you know what I'm talking about? I
mean, I know the game. It's the most recent Zelda game, but
yeah. Well, there's a bit of controversy about the way that game has been made, but it's a brilliant game. I spend hours every week. I mean, I'm not obsessive, but I like it. It's my entertainment, and the games that I played certainly made me want to write a story about a game. And again, as in the Brick, Stick, Straw and in Emergence, what happens in The Seventh Gamer is that somebody gets wind, I think you might say, gets rumors and sees, thinks that she may have found an emergent, independent AI, a conscious AI, and it's the game. I mean, the Seventh Gamer is the game, and it's all related to. It's related to my idea about AI successors rather than machines. I mean, I think in one part of the story, Chloe says, "Where do you look for life? In a jungle, and where do you look for new life? In some festering compost heap sort of thing, not in a lab." Not in an engineering, not in an engineering lab. You look for it just in this heaving mass, which is the game, which is just a heaving mass of human minds and digital and a digital world, just all messed up together. And her idea is that this place, darkening world, which is the name of the game, has become inhabited by a real mind, an unsuspected real mind. It's the way the gamers talk about.
Well, there's this suspicion too that the characters have that some of the other players in the game or characters in the game might be space aliens, which
yes,
I can see why you might have that thought if they're playing online games. Some of these people have got to be very rude space aliens or something.
Yeah. Certainly not human. I mean, there's quite a few, there's a couple of people in the game house where Chloe goes to investigate who are certainly not totally human. But the idea of having a game scenario that was inhabited by a person, so the person was the game scenario, seemed to me an interesting thing to develop, and also it gave me a chance to write about about playing games. So I had a lot of fun with that.
The main character in the story is exploring the sociology of game houses. Is that based in anything real that you looked into?
Yes, but not directly. I've never decided to go explore game houses, but I went to. I was asked to read a paper at an anthropology conference, and I went along, and listen to these people talk, and there were, and then they're modern anthropologists. They go and study at what's actually happening now, rather than trying to delving back into the past. And there was one woman who had been following a community somewhere. Where was it? Maybe Colorado, somewhere in the mountains. And these people really had some really, really strange beliefs. And she was, I don't think it was actually really that there were games, there were aliens in their game, but it was on a par with that. And she was observing them and the things that they were prepared to do, like things that were putting them in danger of death, because they thought that this supernatural something or other was going to catch them in its arms. And that was one of them. And the other one was someone who'd been living in South America with some indigenous people, and she ended up getting sick, and she was being treated because she was completely out of reach of help from the modern world. She was being treated by the do you call it a shaman when it's South American indigenous people? Anyway, by the doctor, and he was a doctor and a priest, and she was getting this treatment, and she was also the only thing she had to read was Dracula, and it all came together in her mind. And it was a fascinating story of how she actually experienced the mindset of the people who were looking after her. And they did look after her, because there she was back in the university telling the story. So it worked, whatever it was. But she really thought that while it was happening, she was really in her fever, thinking that something supernatural was going on. And so that kind of thing I took away from that conference, and I thought I would really like to write about a gaming story. I would really like to write a game story. And this is the theme that I will use to write my game story. And of course, there is the long ago, my introduction to digital gaming was through my son, who graduated from Sonic the Hedgehog to Final Fantasy. And the first game I played with him as my spirit guide was Final Fantasy VII. And I thought it was just wonderful. And I know I'm not going to get the new one. No, it just would not be the same. That one and Okami, my best games yet.
Yeah. If you're going to play a Final Fantasy VII is a pretty good one to play.
Yeah.
I think the nice thing about writing about video games is then all your video games is just research. I can just count that as research.
Yep. Yep. Go and do some more research. And I've just got to get some more of those shafts that you can get from these sky watchers. But they're really sneaky. And I keep wasting masses of bomb arrows. But I'm getting better at it. Yeah.
All right, so we're pretty much out of time. Do you have any other final thoughts or any other projects you want to mention?
No, not really. I mean, I've been talking for quite a while and my ears are ringing, so maybe I'll just call it a day there. Yeah, well, I am hoping to see the Boulders. Oh yeah, I should mention, I'm hoping to see the Boulders Love books back in circulation. They've been out of print for a while. The first two Boulders Loves books are going to appear as Gallant's Masterworks this year, and I'm hoping that will be followed by the others. So
yeah. The SF Masterworks series, I love that series. I love those books.
Yeah, it was an offer I couldn't refuse. Yes, yeah, I was very pleased to get that.
Yeah, all right, great. So we've been speaking with Gwyneth Jones about her new books, Joanna Russ, and Big Cat and Other Stories. So Gwyneth, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for talking to me.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Gwyneth Jones for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.